does it?
Hopefully. There we go. It's already there. Oh, there it is.
Oh, nice.
It's got my voice in there as well. That is interesting. Okay. I come from a dance music background, so, you know, before composing for TV, I was writing a lot of electronic music, and that was a world that I loved. And so sampling was something that I kind of did very naturally. I sort of faked composing, I felt, for a little while. People have lots of different ways of working, you know. Some will very specifically, you know, compose with an orchestral template. You know, I have friends who kind of have these enormous templates, which is amazing and mind-blowing, and not me in the slightest. I kind of love to start from nothing and kind of see what happens, and quite often by the end of it I'll end up with quite a big template, but I really love the idea of starting from nothing. Okay, so that was just something textural, nothing particularly planned. Let's take a little bit of that.
So what are you dialing in there on that top knob?
So here we've got a wet and dry basically. So that's what I've just recorded in. That's completely dry, but then I'm just mixing in the recorded signal there. So that's just the violin through clouds. It's quite sweet. I like it. Yeah, it just captures these little fragments.
It's so fast as well.
Yeah, it is pretty fast. I studied composition at a university in London called Goldsmiths, which gave me the opportunity as a trained violinist to explore sounds that I might not really expect. And while I was there, I discovered music by some really interesting composers. Cage was probably, I'd say, the most known of composers that really interested me, and I loved the idea that music and sounds could be surprising and unexpected. But I didn't really discover modular synthesis for a long time. I used to kind of create patches using Macs while I was there and build these little instruments or processing patches that will enable me to change the sound of a guitar or change the sound of my violin. But I didn't really know that modular synthesis existed until kind of, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, when YouTube kind of spat out all these people doing these amazing things with it. And I kind of realized that actually by getting a small Eurorack system would enable me to kind of capture some of that randomness and some of that enjoyment as well. You know, it's just that sort of idea of something that can surprise you, that you weren't really expecting, but you can make very musical. What I'm going to do is see if I can recreate something like that violin that was in there. I wonder if we can recreate that in here. It's not too far off, you know. It's quite cool. You're getting the little trills out there, aren't you? Yeah, I like that.
There's a sort of smearing of the sound that's really nice.
Let's assign this to the mod wheel now. That's cool, because I can now search out using just the waves. I can actually,
you can actually see where. That's very interactive.
Yeah, that's quite nice, isn't it? You can see that there's some sonic activity there. So I would kind of go back and forth over that and see what I can get out of it.
I can see why you're enjoying calling this an instrument versus a sample library, because the way you're interacting with the mod wheel there and the way that you're seeking out these little points of experiment, you are playing it as an instrument as opposed to triggering a sample, that's very collaborative, you and the instrument there. And actually having recorded these samples, even though you've obviously got a violin right there, there is something to record that and to be able to experiment with that on such a granular, for want of a better word, level that's really interesting. I would see a time where you might reach for that as opposed to just doing that with your violin anyway, in the context of a cue, or if you were searching out something very specific.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a completely, the source is the same, but it's a different instrument. It allows you to do something completely different with the sound of this violin, which I like. You know, it's not recreating it. It's not, you know, and only I would kind of reach for it in the way that I'm reaching it. I'm sure that if you're composing, you'd use it in a completely different way. And I think that's what I love about this. It's an instrument that people will find their own way to use, rather than kind of using it to find a certain sound. It's not an instrument with a sound, it's an instrument with a personality. Oh, that sounds horrific, but I think it's actually, you know, it has that kind of element to it. I think I've found while using it. The idea trails, we spoke earlier about removing some of the, you know, seeing what's left after you get rid of the main themes from a piece of music. By removing my main violin melodies, or my main, whatever the instrument is that is leading that particular piece of music, if I remove that and then I remove some of the other accompanying elements, I will have reached for my violin, and, you know, I might have laid down some little textural ideas, sometimes just to, you know, help create a certain emotion. Sometimes it might be to give a little bit of pace to a piece of music. I always used to describe them as, you know, string trails, and I'd always send those off to the edit, just in case they were useful at any point. I'd call it trails for no reason other than they're these little winding sounds that kind of overlap and do something interesting. And yeah, sometimes they've really, on a scene, they have really kind of come to life. These really unexpected moments can be really useful.
I think this is also where this is probably one of the best integrations between raw and atmosphere layers that I've seen Fracture do, because it's like, it feels so homogeneous, and when you mute that raw layer, there's a lot that's reinforcing it, but it never overshadows those Atmos layers.
Yeah, it's sort of a really nice blend. I think we blend in here, we've got a combination of some sort of Fracture secret weapons, I think, but then some that I recorded here, some with the violin that I processed with the modular, some synth stuff. So it's an Atmos layer, and this isn't violin from Trails, this is violin that I kind of recorded separate to this, so it feels, so it's doing something slightly different, I think. I don't think I've ever listened to it on its own.
It's so unobtrusive.
Yeah.
It's such a good bed. Just like peeks over the surface.
Yeah, it's just lovely textures.
Yeah.
You could make a whole cue out of it, but it's like, for me, it's not a cue. It doesn't have the sort of elements, you know, all of the elements there, but it certainly is providing some really interesting textures.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, everyone who used this would probably create something slightly different. I loved that session, and I think what I loved about it the most is the fact that none of us planned anything, really. We had a little idea of what might be useful to capture on the day, but the most important thing was that we kind of created some interesting sounds. And I think the idea that, you know, it's that not knowing what will happen that kind of made it a much more creative experience. I think there wasn't much planning. It was more, you know, play what feels natural at the time. I love the sort of textures of that.
Yeah.
actually combine patches as well, which
Oh yeah.
I didn't realise until the lovely people at Fracture told me this. And if you hit shift and just click it, you can kind of get a bit of two. So you've got that scrubbing, and then it's quite nice.
So do you achieve that kind of whispery sound with like minimal rosin, or is there something that you apply to get that really kind of...
So with this particular, so Deviations patch, which is I think my favourite here, you've got that sort of scrubbing. I think it's actually slightly more effective. It's very different on the violin, which is at the top end of the keyboard. And then you get a lot more of the sort of brushing of a bigger instrument. This on a double bass is even more like, it's like you hear that sort of like a swooshing horsehair. It's brilliant. But yeah, it's very, very softly played. It's not really circular bowing. I mean, it sort of has elements of circular bowing in there. Sometimes kind of it's a combination of sortasto and sul ponticello, and that's kind of how you get that. But I think there's a little bit more freedom to it, a little bit more movement, and sort of lots of different tempo changes as well. So it's not that sort of straight texture. It's more of sort of brushing with rises and falls. And that's quite a signature, I think, of Trails. There's, if you go to the synth engine as well, some of the synth sounds, if you hold them for a long time, it could be something quite simple like opening and closing the cutoff over an amount of time. But sometimes, when recording the source materials, there'll be just little fragments where I'll open it up quite quickly, and you'll get these little moments. Yeah, and so you get that in the strings, you have that in the synths, in the granular. Actually, when I first started, and definitely before meeting Fracture, the idea of just grabbing something and sampling it was something that I loved to do. But it was also something I did out of necessity, because I'd grab something and it's like, right, I need to just play these things on the keyboard. The other thing that I really love in flickers, which is another really, really interesting one. This is something that I've done in the past, with multiple recordings of the violin. So I might do 10 different violin tracks and have that. This is a single. So it's a little bit of. It's basically a very free tremolo, that's quite extreme in terms of contrast. So very fast and very, very slow, free bowing, creating these kind of like little flickery textures. But the minute you hit another note, they're all sort of triggering at different times, and so you're getting these different rhythms. It's a really nice effect. I mean, if you like, create 4 or 5 different ones of these. I've done this, and just pan them to different places, and you've got this kind of wash of sounds. I love it. It
sounds like an ensemble, doesn't it? Even though it's the same violin, each of these notes feels like they're very musical, even when you only have one note. I mean, it's beautiful the way it all kind of layers together. But actually, sometimes I love hearing the bow and the string. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about, like, sometimes it encourages you to write more simply in a way that you can kind of just let that fill the space and kind of dance around in it. I think
lovely. It's kind of quite an interesting one. I think if we combine that, say violin and cello, and let's hear the difference. Leave that going forever. Until I stop it.